deep beneath the surface of a world long claimed by darkness, something that should not exist begins to stir. The tomb world of Karath Prime has slumbered for 60 million years. Its halls silent, save for the endless patrol of canoptek constructs and the soft hum of stasis systems maintaining their deathless vigil. The awakening has begun slowly, methodically, as ancient protocols demand. First, the canoptek scarabs emerged from their charging alcoves, their bodies composed of living metal that has not known the touch of entropy since before humanity first looked up at the stars. They scurried through corridors wider than highways, their sensors sweeping for damage, for intrusion, for anything that might threaten the masters who sleep in their crypts. The Necron warriors came next, rising from sarcophagi that bore inscriptions in languages older than the concept of writing itself. They stood in perfect formation, Gauss flares held at the ready, their eye sockets beginning to glow with that characteristic emerald light that speaks of technologies mankind cannot comprehend. Each warrior was once a living being, a member of the Necron tier species who made a bargain with godlike entities called the Katan, trading their flesh and souls for immortality in bodies of living metal. They succeeded in their goal of immortality, but the price was everything that made them truly alive. As more systems came online throughout the vast tomb complex, cryptechs began their work, analyzing damage reports, spanning epochs. Overseers awakened, their consciousness flooding back into mechanical bodies, adorned with the regalia of nobility, from an empire that ruled the galaxy when the Milky Way was young. The tomb world's primary Necron overlord, Achmontek the Unyielding, rose from his ornate sarcophagus deep within the central pyramid, his optical sensors flickering to life as diagnostic systems confirmed his resurrection after millions of years of dreamless sleep. But something was wrong. The reports flooding in from the canoptek constructs spoke of an anomaly. Deep within the catacombs, in a section that should have been empty, the sensors detected something massive, something that generated heat, something that possessed an energy signature completely incompatible with Necron technology. The readings made no sense according to any database the tomb's systems could access. This object was organic in origin, yet also clearly mechanical. It possessed power systems that, while primitive compared to Necron technology, were sophisticated enough to suggest the work of an advanced civilization. Achmontek accessed the tomb's master database, searching through records that stretched back to the War in Heaven itself. Nothing matched. This was not Aeldari technology, not the work of the Old Ones, not anything from the ancient conflicts that had scarred the galaxy before the Necrons entered their great sleep. The energy signature was too crude, too new, too young. Whatever this thing was, it had arrived during the long sleep, an intruder in a tomb that had remained undisturbed for longer than most species had existed. The Overlord dispatched a contingent of warriors to investigate, accompanied by a cryptech named Shutol, the Cataloger. If there was something new in the galaxy, something the Necrons had not encountered before entering their stasis, it fell to beings like Shutol to analyze it, categorize it, and determine whether it represented a threat or merely an inconvenience to be eliminated. The procession moved through the tomb's depths with the patient, inevitable stride that characterized all Necron movement. They did not hurry. They had awakened to find themselves in a galaxy much changed from the one they remembered. Filled with upstart species squabbling over worlds, the Necrons had claimed aeons before such civilizations had even evolved. Time, from their perspective, was merely another resource to be managed. The chamber they entered had once served as a storage facility for weapons deemed too dangerous for standard deployment. The walls were inscribed with warning glyphs in the Necron tier language, symbols that had not been read by living eyes for 60 million years. But the warnings spoke of what should have been stored here: crystalline matrices containing captured stars, weapons that could unmake reality itself. Those weapons were long gone, deployed in the final battles against the Old Ones, or destroyed when portions of the tomb complex had suffered cascade failures during the Great Sleep. What remained in the chamber was something else entirely. It stood 3 times the height of a Necron warrior, a massive humanoid construct of metal and ceramite. The design was blocky, functional, bearing none of the elegant curves and mathematical perfection that characterized Necron architecture. This was crude work, primitive by the standards of a civilization that had mastered the fundamental forces of reality itself. Yet it was also undeniably sophisticated, a marvel of engineering by the standards of younger races. The construct was white, though the paint had been scorched and scarred by weapons fire. Red lightning bolts decorated its armor plating, symbols that meant nothing to the Necrons but spoke of speed and fury to those who understood their significance. One arm terminated in a massive power fist, easily capable of crushing an armored vehicle. The other arm bore a multi-barreled weapon system, its ammunition feeds and cooling systems visible even through the layers of damage the machine had sustained. The torso was heavily armored, protecting something at its core, something precious, something that the builders of this machine had deemed worth preserving at tremendous cost. Shutol approached carefully, his sensors active, his consciousness interfacing with the tomb's systems to coordinate analysis. The construct was damaged but intact. Scorch marks from Gauss weapons covered its surface, testament to a battle it had survived. But there were other wounds as well, evidence of combat, with multiple weapon types. Plasma burns, bolt shell impacts, the characteristic scarring of energy weapons the Necrons recognized as inferior copies of their own technology. The Cryptek's sensors penetrated the construct's outer armor, mapping its internal systems. What he found fascinated him. At the center of the machine, protected by layers of armor and force fields, was a sarcophagus, and within that sarcophagus, impossibly, was something organic, something alive. The biosignatures were faint, sustained by life support systems that had been running for Emperor, knew how long, but they were present. Whatever this thing was, it contained a living being at its core, interfacing directly with the machine's systems through neural connections that would have impressed even Necron biotransference specialists. But this was not biotransference as the Necrons understood it. The organic component had not been transformed into living metal. Instead, it had been preserved in its original form, however damaged that form might be, and linked to the machine through technology that was primitive but effective. The being within was not truly alive in any meaningful sense, nor was it dead. It existed in a state between, sustained by machines that regulated every aspect of its biology, kept in stasis by systems designed to prevent full consciousness. Shutol accessed the construct's external systems, finding interfaces that spoke of a civilization that had achieved space travel but had not yet mastered the fundamental sciences that would elevate them beyond dependence on crude matter and energy manipulation. The machine's power source was a compact fusion reactor, elegant in its own way but laughably inefficient compared to Necron power systems that drew energy from pocket dimensions. The armor was layered ceramite, strong but limited, unable to regenerate damage or adapt to incoming weapons via the way Necron living metal could. The Cryptek found data storage systems and began the process of accessing them. The information was encoded in a binary system, primitive but logical, and the tomb's computational systems had no difficulty translating it once the encryption protocols were broken. What emerged was a fragmentary record, damaged by time and the stasis system's failure to account for data degradation over extended periods. The construct was called a Dreadnought. It was the creation of warriors known as the Adeptus Astartes, or Space Marines, transhuman soldiers created by an entity these humans worshipped as the God Emperor of mankind. The being within had been a warrior of significant skill and experience, mortally wounded in battle, but deemed too valuable to allow to die. Instead, his shattered body had been interred within this walking tomb, his mind linked to its systems, condemned to continue fighting long after his flesh had failed him. The specific designation emerged from the fragmentary data, a member of the White Scars chapter, warriors known for their preference for speed and mobility in combat, riders of mechanical steeds who struck with the fury of lightning and vanished before retaliation could be organized. The Cryptek found this detail particularly intriguing. Of all the Space Marine chapters whose data he could access through the construct's systems, the White Scars were noted for their horror of entombment, their cultural reverence for freedom and open spaces, making the confines of a dreadnought sarcophagus a form of living nightmare. And yet here, one of their warriors lay, sleeping in the depths of a Necron tomb world, surrounded by beings who had made a similar bargain and paid a similar price, trading mortality for mechanical immortality, and discovering that some costs cannot be calculated until the transaction is complete. The question remained, how had it come to be here? The tomb world's external sensors had been offline during the Great Sleep, the better to avoid detection by those who might disturb the Necrons' rest. Whatever battle had brought this dreadnought to Carath Prime had occurred without the tomb's knowledge, and the warrior had somehow ended up buried in the deep places, his machine body settling into the ancient chambers to continue its long vigil alone. A Humontech, viewing the situation through Shutol's sensor feeds, made a decision. The construct would be awakened, not out of mercy or curiosity, though the Cryptech possessed both in measure, but because information was valuable, and this warrior might possess knowledge of the current state of the galaxy that would prove useful to a dynasty attempting to reclaim its former glory. The Necrons had awakened to find their empire in ruins, their tomb worlds scattered and isolated, whole dynasties lost to malfunction or disaster. Every scrap of intelligence about the civilizations that now claimed the galaxy was precious. But first, they needed to understand what they were dealing with. Shutol began a detailed scan of the Dreadnought systems, mapping every circuit, every connection, every subsystem. The machine was sophisticated by the standards of younger races, but to a Cryptech who had helped design the biotransference process that transformed an entire species into immortal machines, it was child's play to comprehend its function. What he found painted a picture of desperation and honor of a warrior culture that valued service above all else, even above the peace of death. The Dreadnought's pilot was maintained in a state of minimal consciousness. His biological functions slowed to a crawl, his mind dreaming in the darkness between full awareness and oblivion. The machine's systems were designed to awaken him when combat was required, flooding his consciousness with stimulants and battle data, transforming him from a sleeping invalid into a weapon of terrible power. But the awakening systems were inactive, had been inactive for a very long time. The Dreadnought's internal chronometer, once Shutol managed to decipher its timekeeping system, suggested the machine had been in stasis for over 3 centuries in the current galactic era, 300 years alone in the dark, systems running on minimal power, protecting a warrior who had no way of knowing he had been forgotten, buried in a tomb that was already ancient when his species was still living in caves on their homeworld. The tomb's master systems could awaken the Dreadnought remotely if they wished. The machine's activation protocols were not complex, merely requiring the proper power surge to key systems and a command signal to disengage the stasis locks. But once awakened, the warrior within would be combat capable, a threat that would need to be contained. The Necrons positioned themselves carefully, warriors forming a perimeter with their Gauss flayers trained on the slumbering machine, ready to unleash streams of molecular disassembling energy if the situation turned hostile. Shutol initiated the awakening sequence. The Undying Legion. Understanding the Necrons. To understand the full horror of this discovery, one must first comprehend what the Necrons truly are, for they represent something unique in the nightmare that is the 41st millennium. They are not merely aliens or enemies of mankind. They are the echo of a civilization so ancient, so powerful, that they once ruled the entire galaxy and fought wars against beings that would be called gods by any reasonable definition. And they chose to give up everything, their flesh, their mortality, their very souls, in exchange for the cold certainty of immortality in bodies of living metal. The story of the Necrons begins not with them but with their progenitors, a species called the Necrontyr. They arose on a world bathed in the lethal radiation of their dying sun, a harsh cradle that guaranteed every member of their species would live a short, painful existence filled with cellular degradation and cancer. The Necrontyr were brilliant, driven by their brief lifespans to achieve greatness before death claimed them. They built a civilization that spanned the stars, but their curse followed them wherever they went. Even on worlds far from their poisoned homeworld, their lifespans remained tragically short, their bodies weak and prone to failure. This created a culture obsessed with death and the afterlife, with grand monuments to the deceased that dwarfed the structures built for the living. Their greatest heroes were those who achieved glory before disease claimed them. Their religion centered on the certainty of death and the hope that something lay beyond. But hope was not enough. As they spread through the galaxy, the Necrontyr encountered another species called the Old Ones, beings who seemed to live forever, masters of genetic manipulation, who had seeded life across countless worlds. The Necrontyr demanded the Old Ones share their secrets of immortality, and when refused, they went to war. It was a conflict the Necrontyr could not win. The Old Ones were too advanced, too skilled in the manipulation of fundamental forces that the Necrontyr barely understood. The war was going poorly when the Necrontyr made contact with entities they would come to know as the Satan, the star gods. These beings existed as pure energy within the hearts of stars, ancient and powerful, but initially limited in their ability to interact with the material universe. The Necrontyr's brilliant scientists, in their desperation, forged bodies of living metal for the Cartan, giving them forms that could walk on planetary surfaces and wield power beyond comprehension. The Cartan rewarded this service by offering the Necrontyr exactly what they had always desired: freedom from death. They called it biotransference, a process by which the consciousness of every Necrontyr would be transferred into bodies of living metal, granting them the immortality they craved. The Silent King, supreme ruler of the Necrontyr, accepted this bargain on behalf of his entire species. It was the greatest mistake in galactic history. The biotransference was a success in the purely technical sense. Every Necrontyr's mind was transferred into mechanical bodies far superior to their flesh. They became the Necrons, undying warriors immune to disease, age, and most forms of damage. But something vital was lost in the translation. Their souls, the essential spark that made them living beings rather than merely conscious machines, were consumed by the Khatan as payment for the process. The Necrons found themselves existing in a horrible twilight, aware and thinking but empty, devoid of the emotions and connections that had once given their lives meaning. The lower castes suffered the worst. Necron warriors, the rank and file of their society, were reduced to little more than automatons, capable of following orders and executing combat protocols, but possessing almost no independent thought or memory of who they had once been. The nobility fared better. Their transfer performed with more care, allowing them to retain more of their personalities and memories. But even they discovered they could no longer feel joy or love or any of the countless small pleasures that made existence worthwhile. They had gained immortality, but lost everything that made immortality desirable. Worse still, the Khatan proved to be terrible masters. With the Necrons as their weapons, the Star Gods waged war against the Old Ones, with a fury and malice that transcended mere military conquest. They did not simply defeat their enemies, they tortured entire civilizations, harvesting the life energy of billions, experimenting with cruelties that served no strategic purpose beyond satisfying the Khitans' hunger and cruel amusement. The galaxy burned in what would be called the War in Heaven, and the Necrons served as both warriors and victims, their mechanical bodies marching to war at the whim of beings who viewed them as little more than useful tools. The war lasted for millions of years and reshaped the galaxy itself. The Old Ones unleashed new warrior races, including the Aeldari, who would one day inherit the galaxy after their creators fell. They experimented with psychic powers, tapping into the Imperium, the warp, in ways that would have consequences far beyond their comprehension. The conflict grew so intense that it began to tear at the fabric of reality itself, creating entities in the warp that fed on the emotions generated by the war's countless atrocities. Eventually, the Necrons found a way to rebel against their cruel masters. In a coordinated assault across the entire galaxy, they turned on the Cetan and shattered them, breaking the Star Gods into countless shards that could be imprisoned within Tesseract labyrinths. It was a victory, but a hollow one. The Necrons were free from servitude, but still bound to their mechanical forms, still soulless, still empty. The Silent King, consumed by guilt over what he had done to his people, deactivated the command protocols that allowed him to control all Necrons, and departed the galaxy on a self-imposed exile that would last for 60 million years. Before leaving, he gave one final command. The Necrons would enter stasis, sleeping in tomb complexes constructed on worlds throughout the galaxy. They would sleep until the wars that ravaged the universe had ended, until the Aeldari had risen and fallen, until the galaxy was quiet enough for the Necrons to reclaim it. The Great Sleep was supposed to be a calculated retreat, a strategic withdrawal that would allow them to return when conditions were favorable. It did not go as planned. 60 million years is a long time even for machines designed for immortality. Many tomb worlds suffered cascade failures, entire dynasties lost as their stasis systems degraded beyond repair. Others were discovered and destroyed by the Aeldari, who recognized the sleeping Necrons as a threat and attacked tomb worlds wherever they found them. Tectonic activity destroyed some worlds, burying the tombs beneath mountains or dropping them into the molten cores of their planets. Stars went supernova, consuming their systems and any tomb worlds within them. Those who survived found their empire fragmented and scattered. The grand dynasties that had once ruled the galaxy discovered they now commanded only a handful of worlds, their territories claimed by upstart species who knew nothing of the ancient wars. Worst of all, the galaxy had changed in ways they could not have predicted. The warp, once merely an alternate dimension useful for faster-than-light travel, had become infested with entities called daemons, creatures born from the emotions and nightmares of mortal minds. The Aeldari, once servants of the Old Ones, had built a vast empire that collapsed in an apocalyptic event that tore a hole in reality itself. And humans, a species the Necrons had no record of, had claimed vast swathes of the galaxy under the banner of an Imperium, led by a being they called the God Emperor. The awakening Necrons found themselves in a galaxy unrecognizable from the one they remembered. Their response varied depending on which dynasty and which ruler controlled a particular tomb world. Some, like Imhotep the Stormlord, immediately began campaigns of conquest, determined to reclaim what was rightfully theirs through overwhelming military force. Others, like Trazyn the Infinite, became more interested in cataloguing and collecting the strange new galaxy they found themselves in, building vast museums filled with artifacts and specimens from every species and era. Still others, driven mad by the damage done to their consciousness during the Great Sleep, pursued goals that made no sense to anyone, including sometimes themselves. But all Necrons shared certain characteristics. They were nearly indestructible, their bodies made of living metal that could repair damage automatically. When badly wounded, they would phase out, teleporting back to their tomb worlds to be repaired or have their consciousness transferred to a new body. Their weapons operated on principles that made Imperial technology look like stone tools by comparison. Gauss weapons stripped targets apart molecule by molecule, pulling them toward the weapon's barrel as they dissolved. Tesla weapons unleashed arcs of lightning that could leap from target to target. Particle beams and entropic energies aged targets millions of years in seconds, reducing mighty war machines to rust and dust. More terrifying than their weapons was their reanimation protocol. Necrons that appeared to have been destroyed would simply stand back up moments later, their bodies reconstructing themselves from the molecular level. Only total annihilation could guarantee a Necron was truly gone, and even then, their consciousness might have been transmitted back to their tomb complex before their body was destroyed, ready to be downloaded into a new form. Fighting the Necrons was like fighting the ocean. You might destroy individual waves, but the tide itself was inexhaustible. Their army organization reflected the hierarchical society they had maintained since their days as the Necrontyr. At the bottom were the warriors, millions of souls reduced to little more than programmed responses and basic combat protocols. They marched in perfect synchronization, firing their weapons with mechanical precision, feeling no fear or pain or hesitation. Above them came the Immortals, warriors who retained slightly more of their original personalities, capable of basic tactical thinking and equipped with better weapons. Canoptech constructs, mindless machines designed to maintain the tomb worlds, served as scouts and maintenance units, Their programming focused entirely on preserving Necron infrastructure. The nobility maintained strict hierarchies. Lords commanded tomb complexes or strike forces, their personalities largely intact, allowing them to make strategic decisions and command respect through force of will, rather than merely programmed obedience. Above them were overlords, rulers of multiple tomb worlds, whose authority extended across entire star systems. Cryptechs served as a special caste, technicians and scientists who understood the advanced technology that even other Necrons took for granted, able to manipulate exotic energies and repair the most complex systems. And at the top of each dynasty sat a Pharaon, supreme ruler of an entire Necron empire, whose word was law across countless worlds, and whose ambitions spanned the galaxy itself. This was the civilization that now stirred in the tomb complexes of Carath Prime. This was the force that had discovered a foreign machine buried in their ancient chambers, a construct built by a species they had never encountered before entering their great sleep. And they were about to awaken the warrior trapped within that machine, to see what manner of being the young races had created in their long absence from the galaxy's conflicts. The swift and the free, the white scars. To understand what the Necrons had found, one must understand the white scars, for they are perhaps the most distinctive of the first founding Space Marine chapters. Warriors whose culture and philosophy set them apart from their brothers in ways both profound and subtle. Where other chapters emphasize siege warfare, or close quarters brutality, or methodical tactical doctrine, the white scars embody one concept above all others: speed. But this is not merely a preference for fast vehicles or rapid deployment. For the sons of Jagatai Khan, speed is philosophy, culture, and identity woven together into a way of war that has endured for 10,000 years. The White Scars draw their lineage from the 5th Legion, created during the Emperor's gene crafting of 20 Space Marine legions to prosecute his great crusade across the galaxy. Each legion was built around the genetic template of a Primarch, superhuman beings created by the Emperor himself to be the greatest warriors humanity had ever produced. But the Primarchs were scattered across the galaxy while still infants, stolen by the powers of chaos and deposited on distant worlds where they would grow in isolation from their father and their intended purpose. Jagatai Khan landed on a world the Imperium would come to know as Cho'Garis, though its inhabitants called it Mundus Planus. It was a planet of vast steppes and high plateaus, wide open spaces where nomadic tribes rode swift horses and competed for territory and honor. The Khan, as he would be known, rose to unite these tribes, not through conquest alone, but through a combination of military genius, philosophical insight, and personal charisma that made even defeated enemies willing to follow him. He was not merely a warrior but a philosopher king, a man who understood that true strength came not from standing firm against adversity, but from the ability to adapt, to move, to strike where the enemy was weakest, and vanish before retaliation could be organized. When the Emperor finally found Jagatai and reunited him with the 5th Legion that bore his genetic legacy, the Khan remade his warriors in his own image. They would be Space Marines, transhuman soldiers enhanced far beyond mortal capability, but they would also be sons of the steppes, embodying the culture and philosophy that had made the Khan what he was. They recruited almost exclusively from the nomadic tribes of Cho'Garis, young men who had grown up riding across endless plains, understanding instinctively the importance of mobility and the weakness of static defense. The transformation from tribal warrior to Space Marine was brutal and comprehensive. Aspirants underwent genetic modification that rebuilt their bodies from the cellular level up, implanting additional organs that made them stronger, faster, more resilient than any baseline human could hope to become. Their bones were wrapped in ceramite to prevent breaking under the stress of combat. Their blood was enhanced to carry more oxygen and clot almost instantly from all but the most severe wounds. Additional hearts and lungs provided redundancy, making them nearly impossible to kill through organ failure. Their muscles were rebuilt with tissue that could exert force far beyond what their size suggested, turning even the smallest Space Marine into a being capable of tearing armored doors from their hinges or punching through reinforced walls. But physical enhancement alone did not make a White Scar. The chapter maintained its connection to Chogorian culture with a fervor that some other chapters found excessive or even primitive. Recruits were required to learn the Chogorian language and immerse themselves in the poetry, art, and philosophy of the steppes. They underwent ritual scarring, traditional designs cut into their flesh and packed with ash to leave white ridges that gave the chapter its name. These scars were not merely decorative. Each carried meaning, representing oaths sworn, battles fought, brothers lost, or personal philosophies adopted. A white scar's scarring told the story of his life to those who could read it, a living chronicle written in skin and commitment. The chapter's organization reflected both Codex Astartes doctrine and Chogorian tradition. While they maintained the standard 10 companies of approximately 100 space marines each, they referred to these as brotherhoods rather than companies, and their leaders bore the title Khan rather than captain. The first company, called the Spearpoint Brotherhood, consisted of veterans trained in the use of Terminator armor and other ancient technologies, though they saw deployment less frequently than other chapters' veteran companies. As Terminator armor's slow, ponderous movement offended White Scar's sensibilities, even when its superior protection would be useful. What truly distinguished the White Scars was their preference for speed and mobility above all other tactical considerations. Where other chapters might deploy heavy tanks or establish fortified positions, the White Scars favored attack bikes and land speeders, vehicles that could strike hard and disengage before the enemy could respond. They maintained a disproportionately large number of bike squads compared to other chapters, with many White Scars spending more time aboard their mechanical steeds than on foot. These were not merely transportation. The bond between a White Scar and his bike approached the spiritual, a partnership between warrior and machine that allowed for stunts and maneuvers that would be impossible for less skilled riders. Their tactics in battle reflected this mobility-focused philosophy. The White Scars rarely engaged in prolonged firefights or siege warfare if they could avoid it. Instead, they excelled at lightning strikes and raids, identifying key targets in enemy formations and hitting them with overwhelming force before withdrawing to strike elsewhere. They would circle an enemy army like wolves around a herd, probing for weaknesses, exploiting gaps in the defensive line, creating chaos and confusion that prevented effective coordination. By the time the enemy organized a response to one attack, the White Scars had already struck somewhere else, their white and red armor appearing and vanishing like ghosts on the battlefield. This approach to warfare came with philosophical underpinnings that went beyond mere tactical doctrine. The White Scars valued freedom and self-expression in ways that some other chapters found uncomfortable, where the Ultramarines emphasized discipline and adherence to established doctrine, and the Imperial Fists prided themselves on their ability to endure any hardship through stoic determination. The White Scars celebrated the joy of combat, the thrill of movement, the exhilaration of riding at maximum speed across an open plain with the wind in their faces and enemies falling before them. They were warriors who fought not out of grim duty alone, but because there was genuine pleasure to be found in the perfection of violence executed with skill and grace. This made them appear savage or undisciplined to outsiders who did not understand their culture. Certainly, the White Scars could be loud and boisterous when not in combat, given to feasting and throat singing and celebrations that seemed incongruous with the grim darkness of the 41st millennium. But this was not the mindless savagery of, say, the Space Wolves, or the blood hunger of the Blood Angels. The White Scars maintained a philosophical sophistication that many would not expect from warriors who painted lightning bolts on their armor and whooped with joy as they charged into battle. Every White Scar was expected to be literate in Chogorian and to study the poetry and philosophical texts that formed the foundation of their cultural identity. They practiced calligraphy, composed verses, engaged in debates about the nature of duty and honor and freedom that would have seemed more at home in a monastery than a military barracks. They understood that there was no contradiction between being a warrior of terrible skill and being a thoughtful, cultured individual. Indeed, they viewed these as complementary rather than contradictory aspects of a complete person. This cultural emphasis on freedom and the open spaces of their homeworld created a particular attitude towards certain aspects of Space Marine existence. The White Scars loved wide-open battlefields where they could maneuver freely, hated close quarters, fighting in hive cities where their mobility advantage was negated, and absolutely despised void combat, where their bikes were useless and movement was restricted to narrow corridors. They were comfortable in trenches when necessary, but never happy there, always eager to break free and resume the mobile warfare that defined their approach to conflict. And this brings us to perhaps the most significant aspect of White Scar's culture for understanding the horror of this story: their relationship with dreadnoughts. For the White Scars, more than for any other chapter, interment in a dreadnought represented a fate arguably worse than death. Other chapters viewed dreadnought service as an honor, a chance for a fallen hero to continue serving the Emperor even after mortal wounds should have claimed him. The White Scars understood this intellectually, but emotionally, culturally, at the deepest level of their identity, they found the idea abhorrent. To be entombed in a dreadnought was to lose everything that made a White Scar who he was. No more riding at speed across open plains, no more feeling the wind or the sun, no more movement that was not measured in the ponderous strides of a walking tank. The dreadnought might be powerful, might be nearly indestructible, might allow a warrior to continue fighting for millennia, but it was also a prison that denied its occupant the one thing the White Scars valued above all else: freedom. The chapter maintained very few dreadnoughts compared to other first founding chapters. Those few they did possess were known as the Yuhan Solban, the guardians of the morning and evening stars in the Chagorian tongue. This poetic title hid a more practical purpose. When not deployed in battle, these dreadnoughts served as guardians of the chapter's gene seed vaults, protecting the biological legacy that allowed the White Scars to create new space marines. It was a task that required little movement, allowing the entombed warriors to serve without being constantly reminded of what they had lost. Some warriors who were grievously wounded and faced the choice of death or entombment would choose death, preferring to have their gene seed extracted and their names added to the rolls of the honored fallen, rather than spend eternity locked in an armored sarcophagus. Those who did accept entombment often underwent the Tsevele, a rebranding ceremony where they discarded their old name and chose a new one from the Bartabish, a monument to undying heroes. This ritual death and rebirth was an attempt to help both the warrior and his brothers accept the transformation, to acknowledge that the person they had known was gone, replaced by something that served the same purpose but could never be the same. For a White Scar to end up alone, sleeping in the depths of a Necron tomb world, forgotten by his chapter, his machine body keeping him alive in the darkness for centuries, while his brothers rode to war without him, was a horror that transcended mere physical suffering. It was everything the White Scars feared about dreadnought service made manifest, the ultimate nightmare of a culture that valued freedom and movement above all else. Eternal imprisonment, with no hope of release, no brotherhood to give his suffering meaning, no battles to justify his continued existence. And that was exactly what the Necrons had found. The walking tombs. Understanding dreadnoughts. To comprehend the full tragedy of what lay in the depths of Kareth Prime, we must understand what a dreadnought truly is, for it represents one of the most profound contradictions in the Imperium's treatment of its heroes. On one hand, dreadnoughts are viewed as honored ancients, walking reliquaries that preserve the wisdom and skill of the chapter's greatest warriors long after their flesh should have failed. On the other hand, they are prisons of the most absolute sort, coffins for the living, who cannot die and cannot truly live, machines that grant a kind of immortality while taking away almost everything that makes life worth living. The technology behind dreadnoughts dates back to the Great Crusade and possibly earlier, to the Wars of Unification that first brought terror under the Emperor's control. The concept is simple in its horror. Take a space marine who has been mortally wounded, so catastrophically damaged that even the considerable abilities of apothecaries cannot repair him, but whose brain and portions of his spinal cord remain intact. Extract what remains of his living tissue and encase it in a cybernetic sarcophagus equipped with life support systems that will maintain his biological functions indefinitely. Then integrate that sarcophagus into a massive armored walker equipped with weapons too large for a normal space marine to carry, creating a war machine that combines the tactical experience of the fallen warrior with the durability and firepower of a battle tank. The process of creating a dreadnought is neither quick nor certain of success. When a space marine is wounded so severely that death is inevitable, apothecaries make the immediate decision whether he is a candidate for Dreadnought interment. Not every wounded marine qualifies. The injuries must be severe enough that conventional medical intervention is useless, but not so severe that the marine's brain has been irreparably damaged. If the decision is made to attempt interment, the wounded marine must be stabilized and transported to the chapter's fortress monastery as quickly as possible, sometimes fighting through ongoing battles while carrying a dying hero who must be kept alive long enough to complete the transfer. Once in the chapter's medical facilities, tech marines and apothecaries work together to perform the delicate surgery required. The marine's remaining organs are carefully extracted and preserved, though most will never be used again. His gene seed, the precious biological material that allows the chapter to create new space marines, is harvested to ensure it is not lost, even if the interment fails. What remains, the brain and spinal cord and perhaps a few other organs necessary for basic biological function, is sealed within a sarcophagus that will become the warrior's entire world for however long he continues to serve. The sarcophagus itself is a marvel of biotechnology and cybernetics. It contains nutrient fluids that bathe the occupant's remaining tissue, providing everything needed for cellular function. Waste products are filtered out and recycled. Temperature and pressure are maintained at optimal levels. Neural interfaces connect directly to the warrior's brainstem and spinal cord, creating a mind impulse unit that allows him to control the Dreadnought systems as though they were his own body. Sensors feed information directly into his nervous system, giving him a kind of perception, though one fundamentally different from natural sight or hearing. The Dreadnought chassis itself varies in design depending on the chapter and the specific pattern being used. The most common is the Castroferum pattern, a bipedal walker standing approximately 3 times the height of a normal space marine, with one arm mounting heavy weapons like assault cannons or multi-melters, and the other typically equipped with a power fist for close combat. These machines are heavily armored, capable of withstanding fire that would destroy normal infantry, and possess enough firepower to threaten vehicles and fortifications. They move with surprising agility given their size, their pilots' enhanced reaction times, and the advanced servo motors, allowing for precise control. Other patterns exist. The Contemptor pattern, relic machines from the days of the Great Crusade, even more powerful, but difficult to maintain. The Redemptor pattern, created to house Primaris Space Marines. The Enhanced Warriors, created by Archmagos Belisarius Call, though these exact such a toll on their pilots that they often burn through their occupants' remaining biology within decades rather than millennia. Specialized variants like the Furioso pattern used by the Blood Angels, or the unique Dreadnoughts created by chapters that have access to rare archaeotech or possess their own peculiar traditions. What all Dreadnoughts share is the fundamental nature of the existence they impose on their pilots. When the Mind Impulse unit is active, and the Dreadnought is deployed for combat, the pilot experiences a kind of sensory perception that approximates normal consciousness. He can see through optical sensors, hear through audio pickups, even feel in a distant, mediated way through pressure sensors and damage reports that translate into something approaching pain. He can move, targeting enemies with weapons that respond to his thoughts, striding across the battlefield with purpose. In these moments, there is something like life, a connection to the physical world and the brotherhood of combat that makes the entombed existence bearable. But Dreadnoughts are not deployed constantly. Even with their advanced life support systems and durability, the strain of operation is considerable. The neural load of controlling such a massive machine, while processing combat data and executing complex tactical decisions, takes a toll on the pilot's psychology. Moreover, most chapters do not have enough Dreadnoughts to deploy them in every battle, reserving these valuable assets for crucial conflicts where their power can make a decisive difference. This means that for the majority of their existence, Dreadnought pilots are in stasis. Stasis is different from sleep. A sleeping mind dreams, processes, memories, experiences at least a minimal level of consciousness, even in the deepest stages. Stasis is closer to the complete cessation of biological time, a state where the occupant simply does not exist in any meaningful sense until reactivated. When a dreadnought is placed into stasis, his sarcophagus is removed from the chassis and stored in special chambers deep within the chapter's fortress monastery. The life support systems continue their function, but consciousness is suppressed through a combination of chemical agents and neural inhibitors that place the pilot's brain in a state of profound hibernation. The experience of stasis is, by definition, not an experience. The pilot goes to sleep expecting to wake up moments later, only to find upon awakening that years or decades or even centuries have passed. His brothers have aged, though Space Marines age slowly. New recruits have joined the chapter who were not yet born the last time he woke. The galaxy has changed in ways large and small, and the dreadnought pilot finds himself more isolated, more disconnected from the world he once knew, his last period of consciousness receding into memory like a dream that becomes less substantial each time he wakes. Many dreadnoughts are roused only rarely, perhaps once in a human lifetime or less. They become living relics, ancient warriors whose memories stretch back centuries, or even millennia, who can speak of battles and campaigns that have become legend, who knew the Primarchs, or fought in the Horus Heresy, or witnessed events that are now the subject of scholarly debate among chapter historians. These venerables are treated with deep respect, not merely as weapons, but as living connections to the chapter's history, sources of wisdom and tactical knowledge accumulated over lifetimes of war. But this respect does not change the fundamental nature of their existence. Each time a dreadnought wakes, he finds himself more isolated from the world of the living. His former brothers-in-arms are gone, replaced by strangers who know him only as an ancient, honored by tradition, rather than as a comrade who fought beside them. The galaxy continues to change, becoming less and less like the one he remembers from his youth. Even his own memories begin to feel suspect, degrading over the millennia as the organic components of his brain struggle to maintain coherence across spans of time that were never intended for mortal minds. Some dreadnoughts handle this gracefully, accepting their role as guardians and counselors, finding purpose in service, even when that service comes at the cost of genuine connection to the world. Others become bitter and withdrawn, resenting each awakening as a reminder of what they have lost. A few go mad, their minds unable to cope with the combination of isolation, sensory deprivation, and the fundamental disconnect between the memory of having a body and the reality of being a machine. Chaos Dreadnoughts. Those piloted by traitor Marines who fell during the Horus Heresy are often driven insane by millennia of service, kept chained between battles because even their own allies recognize they have become too unstable to be trusted when not actively fighting. The psychological impact varies by chapter and by individual. The Ultramarines, with their emphasis on duty and discipline, train their dreadnoughts to view their service as simply an extension of their previous role, something to be endured with the same stoic determination that characterizes all aspects of the chapter. The Space Wolves treat their dreadnoughts with a kind of boisterous camaraderie that helps maintain connection to the pack, though even they cannot entirely overcome the isolation inherent in the dreadnaught's existence. The Blood Angels' dreadnoughts often fall to the Black Rage, the genetic curse that afflicts their chapter, requiring them to be transferred to Death Company dreadnoughts that embrace rather than resist their maddened state. And then there are the White Scars, for whom dreadnought service represents a fate specifically tailored to violate everything they hold sacred. The warriors of Cho'Garis define themselves through movement, speed, and freedom, to trap them in a walking tomb that moves only slowly, that confines them in ways more absolute than any prison, that denies them the ability to feel the wind, or ride at speed, or experience the simple joy of unencumbered movement, is to destroy their identity while preserving their consciousness to witness that destruction. The few White Scars who accept dreadnought service do so knowing they are choosing a living death, sacrificing everything that made them who they were for the abstract benefit of continued service to the Emperor and their chapter. They are honored for this sacrifice, but the honor tastes of ash to warriors who would have preferred the clean ending of death to the endless half-life of the dreadnought sarcophagus. Now imagine such a warrior, already bearing this burden, finding himself not merely entombed in his sarcophagus, but lost, separated from his chapter, sleeping alone in darkness, with no brothers to give his suffering meaning, and no battles to justify his continued existence. Imagine waking from stasis not to the familiar halls of your fortress monastery and the faces of your brothers, but to the cold, alien architecture of a tomb world built by beings who died and were reborn as machines millions of years before your species existed. Imagine that moment of realization when consciousness returns and the first emotion after confusion is the dawning horror of absolute isolation. That was what was about to happen in the depths of Kareth Prime. The nightmare within, white scars, and Dreadnought service. Understanding the specific horror that Dreadnought service represents for the white scars requires delving deeper into the psychological and cultural dimensions of their philosophy. This is not merely about preference or tradition. It touches on fundamental questions of identity and what makes existence worth continuing. The White Scars culture, inherited from the nomadic tribes of Chogoris, is built around concepts that might seem primitive to those who have never lived on the endless steppes of that world. But these concepts have proven remarkably resilient, surviving the transformation of tribal warriors into transhuman space marines and adapting to 10,000 years of service across countless battlefields. At their core is a belief in the value of freedom, not merely as political independence, but as a state of being that allows for self-expression, authentic choice, and the joy that comes from pushing one's capabilities to their limits. For the people of Chogoris, before they were discovered by the Imperium, life was defined by the relationship between rider and horse, man and steppe. A warrior's worth was measured not just by his skill in combat, but by his horsemanship, his ability to survive on the open plains, his capacity to adapt to changing conditions and exploit opportunities as they arose. The steppe demanded constant movement. To remain stationary was to become vulnerable to enemies, to weather, to the harsh realities of a world that offered no permanent shelter. Success came from reading the land, understanding when to attack and when to withdraw, knowing that survival often meant being elsewhere when your enemies expected you to stand and fight. When Jaghatai Khan transformed these warriors into space marines, he did not discard these values, but elevated them. The Khan understood that what made his people formidable was not just physical prowess, but a psychological flexibility that other cultures lacked. Where other warriors might view retreat as shameful or value holding ground above tactical advantage, the sons of Chogoris recognized that mobility itself was a weapon. Battles were not won by who could endure more punishment, but by who could strike where it mattered most and avoid being struck in return. This philosophy manifested in countless ways throughout the White Scars' approach to warfare. They favored bikes over tanks, not because bikes were superior in firepower or protection, but because bikes allowed for a connection between warrior and machine that approximated the relationship between rider and horse that had defined Chogorian warfare for millennia. A white scar on his bike was not merely transported, he was enhanced. His speed and mobility multiplied while retaining the agency and direct control that made him feel alive in combat. They approached battle with what might seem like joy, but was actually something more complex. A recognition that in the moment of perfect violence, when skill and speed and courage came together, there was something approaching transcendence. Not the mindless bloodlust of berserkers, but a calculated excellence, the satisfaction of doing something extraordinarily difficult with grace and precision. This was not incompatible with their philosophical sophistication. Indeed, it required that sophistication to fully appreciate the aesthetic and technical perfection of a well-executed assault. All of this makes Dreadnought service particularly devastating for a White Scar. Other chapters mourn the necessity of interring their warriors in Dreadnoughts, but they can frame it in ways that maintain meaning and purpose. For the Ultramarines, it becomes another form of duty, and duty is central to their identity. For the Imperial Fists, it is endurance made manifest, suffering transformed into purpose. For the Dark Angels, it is continuation of their eternal hunt for redemption. Each chapter finds ways to make Dreadnought service align with their core values, even when it requires sacrifice. But how do you reconcile Dreadnought service with values built around freedom and mobility? How do you find meaning in existence that denies both? The White Scars have tried various approaches. Some reframe it as the ultimate sacrifice, giving up everything they value for the abstract good of the chapter. Others attempt to find meaning in the protection of the gene seed vaults, a stationary duty that at least serves a clear purpose. Still others undergo the Tsevalo ceremony, trying to psychologically separate the warrior they were from the dreadnought they have become. But these are at best partial solutions to an insoluble problem. A White Scar entombed in a dreadnought has not merely lost his body, he has lost his relationship with the world, his ability to experience the freedom that defined his existence, the speed and movement that gave him joy. He has been transformed into everything his culture teaches him to fear: slow, ponderous, trapped, unable to escape even if destruction seems preferable to continuation. The horror is compounded by the fact that dreadnoughts are conscious of what they have lost. They retain memories of riding at speed, feeling the wind, experiencing the rush of a perfect charge across open terrain. These memories do not fade but remain vivid, creating a constant comparison between what was and what is. Every slow step the dreadnought takes is a reminder of how swiftly he once moved. Every confined space he navigates is a reminder of the open steppes he can never see again. Every battle where he must stand and trade, fire rather than striking and withdrawing, is a reminder that his mobility is gone forever. The White Scars, who accept dreadnought service, typically do so for one of two reasons. Some are motivated by desperate need. Their chapter requires their service, perhaps their specific expertise or tactical knowledge, and to refuse would be to abandon brothers who need them. They accept the entombment, knowing it will be a form of torture, but viewing that torture as the price of continued service. These dreadnoughts are often grim and silent, finding little to say between battles, aware that speaking only reminds them and others of what has been lost. Others choose entombment because they have already, in some sense, died. They were warriors who had found their perfect battle, the conflict where they achieved everything their culture valued most, and then were struck down at that moment of transcendence. For them, actual death would have been appropriate, the clean ending to a life well lived. But the chapter's need, or their own sense of duty, prevents them from choosing that ending. They wake in their dreadnought with the knowledge that their story should have ended, that everything after is epilogue to a tale already complete. The most tragic cases are those who are entombed without choice, who wake in their sarcophagus with no memory of agreeing to this fate, their last coherent memory being a battle where they fell. These warriors often go through stages of grief, denial that this is real, anger at being forced into this existence, bargaining for release that never comes, depression as they realize the permanence of their situation, and finally, if they are fortunate, acceptance that allows them to find some purpose in continuation. But acceptance is not the same as peace. Even the most adjusted White Scars dreadnoughts carry with them a burden that warriors from other chapters might not fully comprehend. They are living contradictions, machines that remember freedom, weapons that once were men who valued choice above all else. They serve because service is all they have left. But that service is tinged with sorrow that never quite fades. This background makes the situation on Carath Prime particularly horrifying. Here was a White Scar who had been entombed in his dreadnought, had accepted or at least endured that transformation, and then had been lost. His chapter, for reasons we will explore, had been unable to recover him. He had slept alone in the darkness, his machine body maintaining his life, but providing no comfort, no brotherhood, no purpose. For 300 years he had existed in stasis, unconscious but somehow not truly absent, waiting for an awakening that never came. And now, in the depths of a Necron tomb world, surrounded by beings who had made a similar bargain and paid a similar price, he was about to wake, not to the faces of his brothers, but to the cold curiosity of machines that had once been flesh, and now remembered what they lost in only the most abstract terms. The Necrons, in their way, might be the only beings in the galaxy who could truly understand what the Dreadnought had sacrificed. But understanding is not compassion, and the Necrons had not awakened him out of mercy. They had awakened him because they were curious about what the galaxy had become in their absence. They had awakened him because information was valuable, and he might provide insight into the forces that now claimed the territories the Necrons considered rightfully theirs. They had awakened him to learn, to analyze, to catalogue, and if he proved threatening or dangerous, they would destroy him without hesitation or remorse, their weapons capable of dismantling even Dreadnought armor with horrifying efficiency. The White Scar was about to wake up in his worst nightmare, alone in the darkness, surrounded by enemies, with no clear path to escape or reunion with his chapter. And he was about to discover that sometimes the universe has cruelties more profound than death, and that continuation can be the greatest curse of all. The Fall. How a White Scar ends up in a Necron tomb. The question of how a White Scar's Dreadnought came to rest in the depths of a Necron tomb world requires us to piece together fragmentary evidence and construct probable scenarios from the chaos of war in the 41st Millennium. The exact circumstances may never be fully known, but certain facts constrain the possibilities and allow us to understand the sequence of events that led to this particular tragedy. Carath Prime had been designated an imperial world for over 2,000 years, settled during one of the many crusades that pushed the Imperium's borders outward in the millennia following the Horus heresy. It was classified as a mining world, valuable for the exotic materials that could be extracted from its mineral-rich crust. The settlers who claimed it knew nothing of what slumbered far beneath their feet, in chambers built when humanity was still evolving on old Earth. The White Scars maintained a presence in the sector, though not a permanent one. They patrolled constantly, never remaining in one location long enough to be pinned down or predicted. When threats emerged, they would appear seemingly from nowhere, strike with overwhelming force, and withdraw before the enemy could mount an effective response. This made them invaluable for rapid response to emerging crises, but it also meant they were spread thin, small strike forces ranging across vast territories, rather than concentrating their strength in any one location. 312 years before the Necrons awakened on Carath Prime, an incident occurred that would eventually draw the White Scars into what should have been a routine combat operation. Orc raiders had emerged from the warp near the Carath system, a small force by the standards of greenskin invasions, but still significant enough to threaten the mining operations that made the planet valuable to the Imperium. The planetary defense forces engaged the Orcs in the outer system, buying time for an astropathic distress call to reach the nearest Imperial forces. The White Scars' Fourth Brotherhood responded to the call, their strike cruiser translating from the warp at the system's edge and making best speed toward Carath Prime. The situation appeared manageable. The Orcs had managed to land significant forces on the planet's surface, but they were disorganized, lacking the massive numbers or the intimidating leadership that made greenskin forces truly dangerous. This should have been a straightforward cleansing operation, the kind of combat the White Scars excelled at. Identify the Orc concentrations, hit them hard with bike-mounted assault forces, withdraw before the greenskins could bring their crude but effective weapons to bear, repeat until the enemy was eliminated. The operation proceeded according to plan initially. The White Scars deployed their forces across the planet's surface, striking at Orc positions with the precision and speed that defined their combat doctrine. The greenskins, used to enemies who stood and fought, were caught off balance by opponents who appeared, unleashed devastating firepower, and vanished before retaliation could be organized. Within 2 weeks of combat, the Orc force had been reduced to scattered warbands that posed no significant threat. But something was wrong. As the White Scars pursued fleeing Orcs into the planet's less developed regions, moving deeper into territories where Imperial settlement had never been extensive, they began encountering anomalies. Geological formations that did not match the planet's natural patterns, structures that appeared artificial but bore no resemblance to human architecture, energy readings that suggested advanced technology operating far beneath the surface. One particular pursuit led a White Scars strike force, including the venerable Dreadnought Durek the Swift, into a canyon system in Carath Prime's northern hemisphere. The Orcs they were hunting had taken shelter in what appeared to be natural caves, forcing the White Scars to dismount from their bikes and engage in the kind of close-quarters combat they generally preferred to avoid. But the Brotherhood's Khan, had made the tactical decision that eliminating these orcs was worth the temporary sacrifice of mobility advantage. The caves proved deeper and more extensive than initial scans had suggested. The white scars advanced carefully, their enhanced senses alert for ambush, servo skulls, and Auspex units mapping the tunnels as they went deeper. Durek the Swift moved with them, his massive Dreadnought form barely fitting through some passages, but his firepower and durability making him an invaluable asset in the confined spaces where his usual disadvantages were less pronounced. They found the orcs, or rather, the orcs found them, launching an ambush from side passages that caught the white scars in a crossfire. But the Space Marines responded with practiced efficiency, and within minutes, the greenskins were being systematically eliminated. It was in the aftermath of this firefight, as the white scars were confirming kills and treating their wounded, that Brother Sergeant Kulan made a discovery that would change everything. A Gauss weapon impact had collapsed part of the tunnel wall, revealing a chamber beyond that had clearly been sealed intentionally. The technology visible through the gap was like nothing in the Imperium's databases. Xeno in origin, certainly, but not Orcish or Eldari or any of the other major alien species the white scars had encountered. The metal had a strange quality, seeming to reflect light in ways that defied normal physics, and the chamber beyond was vast, extending far further than initial scans had suggested possible given the local geology. The decision to investigate was both tactical and strategic. Unknown xenotechnology potentially represented a threat that needed to be assessed, but it also represented valuable intelligence that could be reported to the Mechanicus or to Chapter Command. The Khan ordered a cautious advance into the chamber, combat squads taking point, while specialists recorded everything they observed. What they found was a tomb. Not a burial chamber in the human sense, but something far more sophisticated and far more disturbing. Thousands of alcoves lined walls that stretched away into darkness, each containing a standing figure of living metal. The figures were inactive, but sensors confirmed they were not simply statues. These were machines with internal power sources, sophisticated systems in standby mode, weapons built into their very frames. The white scars had stumbled into a Necron stasis vault, one of countless thousands scattered across the galaxy, holding the sleeping remnants of an empire that had ruled before humanity existed. The Necrons were still largely unknown to the Imperium at this point in the timeline. The few encounters that had occurred were classified at the highest levels, and the information had not filtered down to most chapter-level operations. The white scars recognized they were looking at something significant, but could not fully comprehend what they had found. The standing figures bore a superficial resemblance to human skeletons, which led some to wonder if this might be some kind of ancient human colony, though the technology was clearly beyond anything the Imperium could produce. The moment of realization came too late. As the white scars advanced deeper into the chamber, as their presence and activities disturbed systems that had been dormant for millions of years, as their weapons' fire and movement triggered ancient proximity sensors, the Necrons began to awaken. Not all of them. Not yet. But enough. The awakening was not immediate. Necron systems are designed with redundancy and caution, bringing warriors online in staged waves rather than all at once. But for the white scars caught in the chamber, it was fast enough. The first indication was a green glow, emanating from eye sockets in thousands of skeletal faces simultaneously. Then movement, jerky at first as ancient servo motors came online after eons of stillness, becoming smooth and purposeful as full operational status was achieved. The Necron warriors stepped from their alcoves, Gauss flares powering up with a characteristic whine that would become familiar and dreaded in battles to come. The white scars opened fire immediately, but their bolters, weapons that could tear through most armor and flesh with ease, seemed to have minimal effect on the awakening Necrons. Living metal absorbed or deflected shots that should have been devastating. Damaged sections repaired themselves almost instantly, the wounds knitting closed as nanoscale machines did their work. Even Necrons that were catastrophically damaged, their bodies blown apart by concentrated fire, did not die, but simply phased out, teleporting away to some distant location for repair. The Necrons returned fire, and the White Scars learned the horror of Gauss weapons firsthand. Warriors who took direct hits simply came apart, molecule by molecule, their armor and flesh dissolving as the Gauss beams stripped away atomic bonds. There was no time to scream, no dramatic death throes, just the dissolution of solid matter into constituent atoms that were drawn back toward the Necron weapons like iron filings to a magnet. The Khan ordered immediate withdrawal, recognizing that this was not a fight his warriors could win through conventional means. The White Scars began a fighting retreat, buying time for their brothers to fall back toward the exit while unleashing everything they had against the advancing Necrons. Melter weapons proved more effective, their incredible heat output overwhelming even living metal's regenerative capabilities. Flamers created walls of promethium fire that forced the Necrons to advance through obstacles while taking damage. But for every Necron that was stopped, two more seemed to take its place. Jurek the Swift positioned himself at a critical choke point, his assault cannon creating a field of fire that even the Necrons found difficult to advance through. His massive form blocked the passage almost entirely, forcing the Xenos to either destroy him or find an alternate route. The other White Scars used the time he bought them to fall back, establishing defensive positions further up the tunnel system, preparing for the next phase of withdrawal. But the Necrons were not limited to ground assault. Scarabs began to emerge, swarms of small constructs that could fly and bypass obstacles. They attached to armored surfaces and began to disassemble them, their molecular manipulation capabilities allowing them to break down even Space Marine power armor. The White Scars found themselves fighting on two fronts, dealing with the advancing warriors while also trying to eliminate the Scarab swarms before they could do critical damage. In the chaos of the running battle, a tactical decision was made that would prove fateful. The tunnels they were retreating through showed signs of instability, weakened by ancient seismic activity, and perhaps by the awakening of the Necron tomb systems below. One of the White Scars tech marines suggested that a controlled collapse might buy them time, trapping the Necrons below ground long enough for the Brotherhood to reach the surface and call in orbital support to deal with what was clearly a major Xeno infestation. The Khan approved the plan. Melter charges were placed at key structural points, positioned to bring down several hundred meters of tunnel when detonated. The White Scars withdrew beyond the blast zone, counting down the seconds until the charges would blow. Jurek the Swift was to be the last to retreat, holding position until the final moment to ensure no Necrons broke through before the collapse. But in war, timing is everything, and sometimes seconds make the difference between survival and catastrophe. The charges detonated as planned, bringing down megatons of rock and soil in a cascade that filled the tunnels completely. The sound was deafening, audible even through the helmet audio dampeners that protected Space Marine hearing from combat noise. Dust and debris filled the air, obscuring vision and sensors alike. When the air cleared enough to assess the situation, the White Scars conducted a roll call. Most of the Brotherhood had made it clear of the collapse zone. Casualties had been surprisingly light, given the intensity of the combat. But Jurek the Swift did not respond to hails. His position had been just within the collapse zone, and the massive weight of falling rock had buried him completely. Auspex scans showed his power signature, still active, somewhere beneath hundreds of meters of collapsed tunnel. The decision to attempt rescue was immediate, but the means proved problematic. The collapse had been so complete that simply digging would take days or weeks, during which time more Necrons might emerge from other access points to the tomb system below. The Khan made the difficult choice that commanders sometimes must. Jurek would have to wait. The Brotherhood would secure the surface, call in reinforcements, and then mount a proper recovery operation once the Necron threat was fully assessed and contained. But situations rarely develop as planned in the chaos of the 41st millennium. The emergence of Necrons on Karath Prime triggered a cascade of events that pulled the White Scars in multiple directions. Other tomb complexes on the planet began showing activity, suggesting that the awakening was spreading. Orc reinforcements arrived in the system, drawn by the psychic pull that attracted greenskins to good fights. A warp storm in the region made reliable communication and reinforcement difficult. The White Scars found themselves fighting on multiple fronts, their resources stretched thin, always promising themselves they would return to recover Jurek once the situation stabilized. But the situation never stabilized. The campaign on Karath Prime turned into a grinding war of attrition that the Imperium was losing. The decision was made at sector level to evacuate Imperial forces and seed the planet with cyclonic torpedoes, virus bombs, and other weapons of mass destruction designed to cleanse it of both Xenos threats. The White Scars withdrew with the last evacuation wave, their records noting Jurek the Swift as lost in action, his recovery impossible given the circumstances. What they could not know was that the bombardment, while effective on the surface, had minimal effect on the deep Necron tomb complexes. The stasis vault where Jurek lay buried was designed to withstand the death of stars. Mere orbital bombardment was an inconvenience, not a threat. The weight of rock that buried him actually protected his sarcophagus from the worst effects of the surface cleansing. And when the Necrons eventually entered their next sleep cycle, satisfied that the immediate threats had been dealt with, Jurek's presence went undetected by their systems. His machine body simply one more piece of advanced technology in a tomb filled with such things. 300 years passed. The Imperium's records listed Karath Prime as a dead world, quarantined and forbidden to settlers, its status as a Necron tomb world noted in classified files that few had clearance to access. The White Scars mourned Jurek the Swift with the others who had fallen in that campaign. His name added to the rolls of the honored dead, his gene seed marked as lost and unrecoverable. The Brotherhood that had fought on Karath Prime continued its service, most of its members eventually falling in other battles, their stories becoming legend within the chapter. And Jurek slept on, alone in the darkness, his stasis systems keeping him in that twilight state between life and death, his last conscious memory being the sound of the tunnel collapsing around him and the satisfaction that his brothers had escaped. He did not dream, for dreadnoughts in stasis do not dream. He simply was not. Existing without consciousness, time passing without perception, waiting in a silence so profound it transcended the concept of waiting. Until the Necrons awakened once more, their systems scanning their tomb complex for damage and threats and resources. Until Cryptek Shutol discovered the foreign machine buried in their chambers. Until they decided that the warrior within should wake, so they might learn what had become of the galaxy in their long absence. Until now, the first stirrings. A dreadnought awakens. The awakening of a dreadnought is never a gentle process. Even under ideal circumstances, when the sarcophagus is properly connected to its chassis in the carefully maintained halls of a chapter's fortress monastery, when tech marines and chaplains stand ready to guide the occupant back to consciousness, when the warrior knows he is waking among brothers to serve the Emperor once more, even then, the transition from stasis to awareness is jarring, disorienting, accompanied by sensory confusion that would break a normal human mind. But this was not ideal circumstances. Jurek the Swift had been in stasis for 3 centuries, far longer than any routine deployment, buried beneath hundreds of meters of rock in a location his chapter had long since abandoned. His last conscious memory was of combat, of holding a choke point against Xenos enemies, of waiting for the signal to withdraw. His unconscious assumption, built into the core of his being by centuries of service, was that he would wake in his chapter's armory with his brothers preparing him for battle. The first sensation was wrongness, a cascade of errors and alarms that flooded his consciousness before his mind had fully emerged from stasis. Power systems were active, but the flows were all wrong. Connections made, but not in the expected configurations. Life support showed green, but the fluid composition was off, adjusted in ways that preserved function but betrayed tampering. His chassis weight distribution was incorrect, suggesting he was not properly mounted in his normal frame. Consciousness rose like a drowning man fighting toward the surface, awareness returning in fragments that did not cohere into understanding. Sensation came back first, but filtered through systems that were not responding properly. Optical sensors were active, but showed only darkness, a void so complete it suggested either total system failure or an environment with no light sources whatsoever. Audio pickups registered sound. but not the familiar noises of a fortress monastery preparing for war. Instead, a high-pitched whine that hurt in ways sound should not hurt, and underneath that, the whisper of movement, mechanical and precise. Jurek's first attempt to move brought more error messages. His power fist was absent, no, present, but the neural connections were severed. His assault cannon similarly showed as available but not responsive to control inputs. This was worse than damage. This suggested his systems had been deliberately disconnected, his weapons and limbs isolated from his control. This was how dreadnoughts were secured when undergoing maintenance, or when they were considered a threat. That thought brought the first coherent emotion: confusion. Why would his brothers consider him a threat? What had happened during the battle that would justify restraining a loyal warrior of the chapter? The gap between his last memory and his current situation was a void his mind could not cross, and the absence of information spawned worst-case scenarios. Then the optical systems began to function properly, and what they showed made no sense at all. He was no longer buried in the collapsed tunnel. Instead, he stood, or rather his sarcophagus was upright, in a chamber that was clearly artificial, but bore no resemblance to any human architecture he had ever seen. The walls were composed of some black metal that seemed to absorb light, decorated with geometric patterns that hurt to perceive directly. The space around him was vast, far larger than any chamber in a Space Marine fortress monastery, the ceiling lost in darkness above, and the walls extending away in perfect mathematical symmetry. And there were presences. His sensors detected them, mechanical entities that surrounded his position in a perfect circle, each maintaining exactly the same distance from his sarcophagus. They were roughly humanoid in shape, but clearly not human, not organic at all. Their bodies seemed to be composed of the same impossible metal as the chamber walls, their design suggesting function refined to its purest essence. Each bore what appeared to be a weapon, held in a firing position, but not yet discharged, as though waiting for some signal or decision. One of the figures was different from the others, more elaborate in design, bearing decorative elements that suggested rank or status. This figure approached his position with movements that were fluid yet somehow mechanical, a perfect blending of efficiency and control that no human could replicate. When it spoke, the sound bypassed his audio pickups entirely, transmitting directly through some means he could not identify, the words forming in his consciousness without the intermediary step of hearing. Identify yourself. Construct. Explain your presence in this sacred space. The language was High Gothic, or something very like it, but the pronunciation was strange, the cadence suggesting a being that had learned the language through analysis rather than use. More disturbing was the casual assumption of superiority in the words, the implication that Jurek was the intruder here, that these beings had the right to demand answers. Jurek attempted to respond, to demand his own answers, to understand what had happened and where his brothers were, but his Vox systems were still not responding properly to neural commands. He tried to move, to bring weapons to bear, to assume a combat stance, but found his limbs remained locked, held in place by some force that his power systems could not overcome, despite being at full capacity. The decorated figure tilted its head in what might have been curiosity, or might simply have been a movement to optimize sensor placement. "You are damaged," it observed, though whether this referred to his current restrained state or to his general condition of being interred in a dreadnought was unclear. "Your systems are primitive, but functional. The organic component remains viable, though its preservation technology is crude by civilized standards." Organic component. The phrase triggered understanding and horror in equal measure. These beings knew what he was, that beneath the armor and weapons lay the broken remnant of a space marine, kept alive by machines that sustained functions his body could no longer perform on its own. But more than that, they spoke of it clinically, analyzing his existence with the detachment of a mechanicus adept, examining a particularly interesting machine spirit. There was no respect in their tone, no recognition of what he had sacrificed, just the cold assessment of specifications and capabilities. "You are not of this world," the figure continued. "Your construction methodology differs significantly from any known technological paradigm of the War in Heaven era. Your power systems, while inefficient, demonstrate principles that suggest independent development. The species that created you has achieved void travel and has developed a rudimentary understanding of nuclear forces. Interesting. The galaxy has been more active during our absence than anticipated. During our absence, the words clicked something into place in Jurek's fragmented consciousness, memory files stirring, accessing data from briefings and strategic assessments from the campaign before the collapse. The Xenos enemies they had encountered in the tunnels, the skeletal warriors of living metal, the weapons that dissolved matter at the molecular level. The intelligence reports had been fragmentary, but there had been whispers, rumors of an ancient species that slumbered in tombs and awakened to reclaim the galaxy they once ruled. Necrons. These were Necrons. The realization brought no comfort. If anything, it made the situation worse. He was not among his brothers being prepared for battle. He was a prisoner of a Xenos species, whose capabilities remained poorly understood, but were clearly formidable. His chapter had no idea where he was, possibly did not even know he survived, and he was completely at the mercy of beings who viewed him as a curiosity to be analyzed, rather than a warrior to be respected. Jurek renewed his efforts to access his weapons systems, to break free of whatever force held him immobile. Every training protocol, every combat doctrine embedded in his consciousness over centuries of service, demanded action. A Space Marine did not submit to interrogation by Xenos. A Space Marine fought until victory or death, and if the former proved impossible, the latter was to be embraced with courage and defiance. Better to die fighting than to allow enemies of the Imperium to gain intelligence that might be used against humanity. But the restraints did not yield. His weapons remained locked offline. His limbs would not respond to commands. He possessed all the power of a Dreadnought and none of its application, like a missile locked in its silo or a blade refused from its sheath. The frustration was worse than fear. The inability to act more terrible than any physical torment these Xenos might inflict. The Necron figure seemed to sense his struggle. Your attempts to activate combat protocols are noted and will be prevented. You represent potential value as a source of information about current galactic conditions. Your destruction would be wasteful. Cease your efforts to escape or attack, and you will not be harmed. Continue, and we will be forced to disassemble you to extract the information from your storage systems directly. This would result in the cessation of the organic component's viability, though the data would remain accessible. The threat was delivered without emotion, a simple statement of tactical options and their probable outcomes. There was no anger or sadism in the words, just the recognition that if one method failed, another would be employed. It was the same tone a tech marine might use when discussing whether to repair a damaged servitor or simply harvest its useful components for installation in other units. But the threat carried information as well. These Necrons valued the data he possessed, but had not yet attempted to extract it forcibly. That meant they either lacked the capability to do so with him still functional, or they preferred willing cooperation to coercion. Either way, it suggested he possessed leverage, however minimal. His continued cooperation was worth something to them, which meant he was not entirely powerless, despite his physical constraints. A white scar, even one entombed in a dreadnought, even one imprisoned and outmaneuvered, did not surrender. But neither did they fight stupidly, when the situation clearly demanded a different approach. Jurek the Swift had not earned his name through mindless aggression, but through the understanding of when to strike and when to maneuver. If these Xenos wanted information, he would provide it, carefully, revealing only what served his purposes, while learning what he could about them in return. The trick would be convincing them to release him from these restraints, and for that, he would need to become something other than a threat in their assessment. He would need to be valuable enough to keep functional but non-threatening enough to allow some measure of freedom. It was a dangerous game, one that his White Scars training had not specifically prepared him for, but the principles were sound. Adapt to the terrain, exploit the enemy's assumptions, wait for the moment when opportunity presented itself, and if that moment never came, If he remained a prisoner until his brothers found him, or until his systems finally failed after centuries or millennia of operation, then he would have traded one form of imprisonment for another, the walking tomb of his dreadnought for the physical captivity of this Xenos vault. Either way, he had lost the freedom that every White Scar valued above life itself. But he had not lost the capacity to choose. Not yet. And so long as choice remained, so too did hope, however faint, however distant. Jurek the Swift, venerable dreadnought of the White Scar's Fourth Brotherhood, decided he would cooperate with his captors. He would give them information. He would play the role of compliant prisoner, and he would wait for his moment to strike. The exchange. Necrons and a space marine. Cryptek Shutol, the cataloger, regarded the captured dreadnought with the analytical precision that had defined his consciousness for longer than human civilizations had existed. This construct represented something genuinely new, a data point in the ongoing assessment of how the galaxy had changed during the Necrons' Great Sleep. The biological component alone warranted extensive study, representing a species that had achieved what appeared to be a crude form of biotransference without access to Cetan technology or the scientific principles that made such transformations possible. The Dreadnought's design philosophy fascinated him. Rather than replacing the organic form entirely, these humans had chosen to preserve it, creating a hybrid system that combined flesh with machine, but maintained the original consciousness in its native substrate. It was inefficient, certainly, requiring constant life support and leaving the crucial neural components vulnerable to damage that could not be easily repaired. But it also avoided the soul transfer problem that had plagued Necron biotransference. The loss of that essential spark that made beings truly alive rather than merely functional. Shutol accessed the information his systems had extracted from the Dreadnought's data storage, piecing together a picture of the civilization that had created this machine. The Imperium of Man, as they called themselves, was vast, spanning millions of worlds across the galaxy. They worshipped a being they called the God Emperor, who had supposedly created these transhuman warriors to serve as his angels of death. The technology they employed was sophisticated by the standards of younger races but primitive compared to what the Necrons had achieved even before biotransference. They relied on ships that traveled through a dimension they called the warp, not understanding that they were navigating through the same immaterium that had enabled the Old One's greatest works and worst mistakes. Most interesting was the fact that humanity seemed to be fighting everyone. Their records mentioned wars against greenskins, against Eldari, against their own corrupted brothers, against countless Xenos species, and internal rebellions. They held territory through constant military pressure. Their Imperium, less a unified empire than a confederation of worlds bound together by faith, force, and the shared understanding that isolation meant death in a galaxy full of predators. And they were remarkably numerous. The data the Dreadnought carried suggested human population numbers in the quadrillions across their millions of worlds. This was the species that had claimed dominion over the galaxy in the Necrons' absence. This crude, short-lived race that had somehow survived and thrived while older, wiser species had fallen or retreated or hidden themselves in pocket dimensions and craft worlds. Shutol found this both encouraging and concerning. Encouraging because humanity clearly lacked the unified cohesion and technological sophistication that had made the Old Ones and the Eldari Empire such formidable adversaries. The Imperium could be defeated, its worlds reclaimed, its populations either eliminated or reduced to servitude. But concerning because numbers mattered in warfare, and humanity possessed numbers on a scale that even the Necrons at the height of their power might have found challenging to counter. All of this made the Dreadnought valuable beyond its merely technical interest. It could provide intelligence about Imperial military capabilities, strategic priorities, current conflicts that might be exploited. It might even provide information about the locations of other Necron tomb worlds, assuming humanity had encountered and catalogued any during their expansion across the galaxy. But extracting that information required the Dreadnought's cooperation, or at least its passive acceptance of interrogation. Shutol had the means to forcibly extract data from the construct's storage systems, but such methods were crude, and risked destroying valuable information stored in neural patterns that might not be captured by direct computational access. Better to allow the occupant to remain conscious and responsive, using conversation as a vector for intelligence gathering. The irony was not lost on Shutol. He was essentially negotiating with his prisoner, treating it as an entity capable of choice despite having eliminated any actual capacity for independent action. The Dreadnought could not move, could not fight, could not escape. But so long as it remained conscious, it possessed agency of a sort. It could choose to cooperate or remain silent. It could provide accurate information or attempt deception. These choices were limited and ultimately meaningless given the power differential. But they existed, and Shutol found himself curious about what choices the imprisoned warrior would make. "You have been damaged," Shutol began, modulating his Vox systems to use the human language with greater precision. He had analyzed thousands of linguistic patterns from the Dreadnought storage and could now replicate not just the vocabulary, but the cadence and structure of Imperial Gothic. "Your physical form was destroyed in battle, necessitating your transference to this mechanical chassis. This is a fate you find unpleasant. The data patterns suggest discomfort, possibly psychological distress related to confinement and loss of mobility." Inside his sarcophagus, Jurek processed this observation with growing unease. The Necron was reading emotional states from his data storage. That meant it had access not just to tactical information and operational logs, but to personal files, to the private thoughts and feelings that Dreadnoughts sometimes recorded during the long periods of stasis. The violation felt worse than any physical damage these Xenos might have inflicted. "Release me," Jurek managed to force through his Vox systems, the words emerging with digital distortion but comprehensible. "Return me to my chapter. They will reward any who aids a servant of the Emperor." Shutol tilted his head again in that gesture that might have been curiosity. "Release is not possible. Your chapter abandoned you during the previous combat engagement on this world. Our records, incomplete, though they are given our status during that period, indicate massive orbital bombardment designed to sterilize the surface. Your brothers believed you lost and enacted protocols to deny this world to all biological entities. They did not search for you. They did not attempt recovery. They fled, leaving you buried beneath collapsed structures to sleep in isolation." The words struck like physical blows, each syllable a denial of everything Jurek had assumed about his situation. The chapter had withdrawn, had considered him lost, had abandoned him. No, that was impossible. The White Scars never abandoned their brothers. Every fallen warrior was recovered if at all possible, their gene seed harvested, their bodies returned for proper rites. To be left behind was a dishonor, a failure of brotherhood that no White Scar would tolerate. But the Necron's words carried the weight of truth. 300 years, the construct had said. Time enough for the chapter to have mourned him and moved on. Time enough for new battles to demand attention, for new warriors to take his place in the Brotherhood. Time enough for Jurek the Swift to become merely a name in the rolls of the honored dead, his story ending with the collapse of a tunnel on a world the Imperium no longer claimed. "You lie," Jurek said, but there was doubt in his voice, audible even through the mechanical distortion. "The White Scars do not abandon their brothers." "Your White Scars are one chapter among many," Shutol replied. "Your species maintains thousands of such organizations, each dedicated to warfare, each suffering losses that necessitate choices about resource allocation. You were one warrior among millions. The tactical decision to withdraw rather than risk additional losses in recovery operations was, from a strategic perspective, logical. Unfortunate for you, certainly, but logical." Jurek wanted to deny this, to insist that the White Scars valued honor above logic, that brotherhood was more important than tactical considerations. But he had served long enough to understand that commanders sometimes made decisions that sacrificed individuals for the greater good of the chapter. Had he not been in such positions himself, before his entombment? Had he not ordered warriors to hold positions that could not be held, knowing they would die but needing the time they could buy? The silence stretched. Shutol waited, patient in ways that only beings who measured time in geological epochs could be. He was not hurrying the Dreadnought toward a decision, merely providing information and allowing its implications to take root. Eventually, the imprisoned warrior would either accept his situation or descend into denial and despair. Either outcome provided useful data about human psychological resilience and the limits of their enhancement programs. "What do you want from me?" Jurek finally asked. "Information," Shutol replied simply. "The galaxy has changed during our absence. Your species occupies territory that is rightfully ours. To reclaim what was taken requires understanding what we face. You possess knowledge of Imperial military capabilities, strategic priorities, technological limitations. This knowledge has value. Provide it willingly, and your continued existence will be more comfortable. Refuse, and we will extract what we need through less pleasant means." "I am a space marine," Jurek said, forcing strength into his voice. "I serve the Emperor of mankind. I will not betray the Imperium to Xenos, no matter what torture you threaten." "Torture?" Shutol seemed genuinely puzzled by this. "We do not torture. Torture is the infliction of pain for psychological effect, an inefficient method of information extraction that often produces unreliable data. If you refuse cooperation, we will simply dismantle your consciousness substrate and analyze it directly. There will be no pain involved, merely the cessation of your existence as a coherent entity. Your information will be preserved and utilized regardless of your cooperation. The only variable is whether you continue to exist as an aware being during this process." The casual cruelty of this statement was somehow worse than any threat of pain might have been. Shutol was not promising suffering but erasure, the end of consciousness itself, treated as a simple technical problem with an obvious solution. Death, at least the death of a warrior in battle, carried meaning. It was an ending that honored service and sacrifice. But what the Necron described was not death but the reduction of a person to data, consciousness dismantled and catalogued like parts from a broken machine. "And if I cooperate?" Jurek asked. "Then you remain functional. Your sarcophagus will be maintained, your biological components preserved. You will be confined, certainly, but conscious. You will be able to observe, to think, to maintain the continuity of self that appears important to your species. Is this not preferable to cessation?" Was it? Jurek was not certain. What did it mean to exist if existence was only consciousness, without purpose, awareness, without agency? At least in his service to the chapter, his imprisonment in the Dreadnought chassis had carried meaning. He fought for the Emperor, for his brothers, for humanity's survival in a hostile galaxy. Stripped of that purpose, was he anything more than a ghost trapped in a machine, existing only because the systems that sustained him continued to function? But surrender was not in his nature, not even surrender to the inevitability of his situation. If he cooperated, he remained functional. And while he remained functional, possibilities existed that did not exist in cessation. Perhaps the chapter would find him. Perhaps these Necrons would make a mistake that provided an opportunity for escape or rebellion. Perhaps, the word might be a lie, hope for the hopeless, but it was all he had. "What do you want to know?" Jurek asked. Shutol's mechanical face remained expressionless, but there was something in his posture that suggested satisfaction. "Everything," the cryptech replied. "Tell me everything about the Imperium of Man, and we shall begin to understand what the galaxy has become in our absence." And so Jurek began to speak, choosing his words carefully, revealing truths that could not be kept secret, mixed with omissions that preserved information the Necrons did not need to know. He spoke of the Imperium's vast size and the mechanisms by which it maintained control across such impossible distances. He described the Astra Militarum, the Imperial Guard armies that served as humanity's first line of defense. He explained the Space Marines and their role as elite forces deployed to crush threats that normal humans could not defeat. He avoided mention of specific chapter deployments, current military operations, classified technologies. When Shutol pressed for such information, Jurek deflected, claiming his data was out of date, his knowledge limited to what had been current 300 years ago. The Necron accepted these limitations, understanding that intelligence naturally degraded with time, and that a single warrior, however experienced, could not know everything about an empire spanning millions of worlds. As he spoke, Jurek learned in turn. The Necrons' questions revealed their priorities, their concerns, their understanding of galactic politics. They were particularly interested in the location of other Xenos species, in the strength and disposition of Imperial forces, in any mention of tomb worlds that humanity might have discovered. Each question painted a picture of an empire awakening to find itself diminished, seeking to understand the strategic situation before committing to action. Hours became days. Days became weeks. The exchange continued, sometimes intensive interrogation, sometimes almost conversational, as Shutol appeared genuinely interested in certain aspects of human culture and philosophy. The Cryptek seemed particularly fascinated by the concept of the Emperor, by humanity's willing submission to a being they had never seen but worshipped as divine, to a species that had rebelled against their gods and shattered them. Such faith was incomprehensible, and through it all, Jurek waited for an opportunity, waited for a moment when Shutol's attention might waver, or when the Necron warriors surrounding him might be recalled to deal with some crisis, waited for any chance to turn his imprisonment into something else, to reclaim even a fraction of the freedom that had once defined his existence. The moment would come. It had to come, because the alternative was to exist forever in this state, conscious but powerless, aware but unable to act. A voice in darkness describing a galaxy he would never see again, to beings who valued him only for the information they could extract before discarding his consciousness, like spent ammunition. And that was a fate worse than any death Jurek the Swift could imagine. Conclusion. In the depths of Karath Prime, in chambers built when the galaxy was young, two products of desperation faced each other across an unbridgeable gulf. The Necrons, who had sacrificed their souls for immortality and discovered they had traded everything that made existence worthwhile for the empty continuation of consciousness in metal shells. And a White Scar Dreadnought, who had made a similar bargain, trading his freedom and the joy of movement for the abstract duty of continued service. They should have understood each other. These victims of similar curses, both imprisoned in mechanical forms, both remembering what it meant to be alive while existing in states that denied life's essential qualities. But understanding requires more than shared experience. It requires empathy, compassion, the recognition that another being's suffering matters. And the Necrons had lost these capacities long ago, along with their souls, traded away for a promise of immortality that had been kept in the most literal and terrible way. The story of what happened next is lost to history, classified in Imperial records or simply unknown. One more tragedy among countless billions in a galaxy that creates new horrors faster than they can be catalogued. Perhaps Jurek the Swift eventually escaped, fighting his way to freedom and reuniting with his chapter to share his terrible knowledge of the awakening Necron threat. Perhaps he remained a prisoner for years, or decades, or centuries, his consciousness slowly degrading as biological systems failed, and the Necrons learned everything they wanted from his memories before finally allowing him the mercy of true death. Or perhaps he still remains there, in the tomb complexes of Karath Prime, a conscious ghost bound to machines that will not let him die, telling his stories to beings who catalogue them as data without comprehending their meaning, waiting in the darkness for rescue that will never come, for an ending that is perpetually deferred by systems designed to preserve existence regardless of whether existence remains worth preserving. This is the horror of the 41st millennium, not merely that heroes fall, but that sometimes they continue long after falling, trapped in states that deny both the peace of death and the dignity of life. It is a horror the White Scars know better than most, for whom freedom and movement define what it means to exist, and for whom imprisonment in a dreadnought represents a fate they fear more than death itself. When Necrons find a sleeping White Scars dreadnought in their tomb, they find something they should recognize: another prisoner of immortality, another consciousness trapped between existence and cessation, another being who made sacrifices and paid prices that seemed reasonable at the time, but proved catastrophic in practice. They find a mirror to their own state, a reflection of what they have become. But recognizing a reflection requires the capacity for self-awareness that the Necrons lost along with their souls, and so they see only an interesting Xenos construct, a source of data, a puzzle to be solved and catalogued, and ultimately discarded once it has provided all the information it possesses. And the Dreadnought, waking to find himself alone among the dead who cannot die, discovers that there are prisons within prisons, layers of confinement that extend far beyond the sarcophagus that encases his failing flesh. He is trapped in his Dreadnought. The Dreadnought is trapped in a Necron tomb. And all of them, Necrons and Space Marine alike, are trapped in a galaxy that grinds on endlessly, creating suffering on scales that dwarf individual tragedies, where the greatest curse is not death, but the inability to die, where service extends beyond any reasonable limit, and duty becomes the chain that binds consciousness to existence, long after existence has lost all meaning. This is the true horror. Not that bad things happen to good people, but that good people continue happening long after they should have ended. Their stories extended far beyond their natural conclusion by technologies that preserve form without preserving purpose. The White Scar dreamed of riding free across open plains, feeling wind and speed and the joy of movement. He ended as a consciousness in darkness, alone among aliens who had forgotten what it meant to dream, waiting for an ending that machines designed to prevent endings would deny him for as long as those machines continued to function. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But sometimes, war is not the worst fate that can befall a warrior. Sometimes, the worst fate is to survive it. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the darkest corners of Warhammer 40,000 lore, if this story of a white scar trapped in a nightmare within a nightmare resonated with you, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. We explore the hidden stories and forgotten tragedies of the 41st millennium, shining light into the dark places where the Imperium's heroes fall, and sometimes, horrifyingly, continue. Share your thoughts in the comments about what you think happened to Durek the Swift, and let me know what other dark corners of Warhammer lore you'd like to see explored. For the Khan, for the Emperor, and for the stories that remind us why we tell these tales of grim darkness among the stars.